This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Hello, and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm your host, Ahval editor David Lepeska, and with me today is returning guest Abdulla Hawez, an independent Kurdish affairs analyst based in London. Hello, Abdullah. Thanks for joining us.
Hello.
We are speaking on May 19, with the world at about 5 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 and 320,000 deaths from the pandemic. Most of the international discussion about Syria in regards to coronavirus has been about the possibility of a devastating outbreak in Idlib, where the healthcare system has been decimated by Russian and Bashar Assad regime airstrikes, and some 3 million displaced people remain squeezed between Assad's forces and the Turkish border. Yet last week, the United Nations bowed to pressure from Russia and Assad and halted funding for aid groups delivering medical relief to northeast Syria, which has suffered considerably in the past few years due to the fight against ISIS and a major Turkish incursion launched last October. Abdullah, how have northeast Syria and the Kurdish-administered area known as Rojava dealt with the pandemic so far? Is there a serious risk there of a humanitarian crisis soon?
I think for now, there's no major risk of a humanitarian crisis, partially because I think Syria and the surrounding region are not, let's say, as open as elsewhere. This is why there's much less cases, or at least less confirmed cases in these regions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the administration in northeast Syria tried to close the border with Iraqi Kurdistan from the, let's say, fairly beginning of the crisis, which was, I think, a good step. But of course, given that they don't control the whole territory that they are, let's say, holding, it's much more difficult for them to actually completely control the region. For example, we had seen lots of statements and criticism from the administration against Syrian government because Kamishli airport is controlled by the Syrian government, and they were not doing any tests for the people who were coming from other places of Syria, which was one of the problems and one of the main differences between Syrian government and the Kurdish administration regarding this COVID-19 crisis. But I think in general, they have been doing well. They have established a hospital specialized for only COVID-19, and there has been let's say, only a couple cases. So far, things seem to be fine, and there was a curfew, which I think negatively affected people economically because many people were depending on their daily wage for their livelihood. So, I mean, when it comes to the COVID-19, I think things are not as bad, but I think it has negatively affected the economic situation in the region.
Well, it's interesting that you say that. On Sunday, 2 days ago, you tweeted that salaries for Rojava public servants had been increased as much as 35% in some cases. To me, this seems like a strange time to increase public wages when governments around the world are going deep into debt and businesses everywhere are going bankrupt and slashing salaries and staff. How did this happen now, and what does it tell us about what's going on there?
I think, as I just mentioned, the economic situation is worsening, partially because the Syrian pound is actually weakening on a weekly basis against dollar. And the problem with the Syrian Kurdish administration, or the region controlled by SDF, it's much more dependent on dollar than elsewhere in Syria. So things are becoming more and more expensive and less affordable for people. Many people say anything less than 500,000 Syrian pounds would not be sufficient for a month. So things are deteriorating, especially economically. I think the Syrian Kurdish administration they were pushed to increase their salaries because economically people are not doing well. and the weakening of Syrian pound versus dollar has made things even worse. So, of course, they don't have many, let's say, incomes or revenues, but they do sell some of their oil. Here I talk about the Northeast administration in Syria, and they are also getting some support from the United States. So I think this increase may be a lot for the people on the ground, but it's not a lot for the administration, because this money, when you convert it to dollar, it's really not a lot.
I see, I see. So it's more a reflection of the declining value of the Syrian pound than having all this extra funding to
Yes.
provide. Okay, okay. Um, at the start of this month, a French delegation visited northeast Syria to hold talks with the group you just mentioned, the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, the militia that served as the main U.S. partner in the fight against ISIS and against which Turkey launched the offensive last October. The reported objective of the talks, which had been initiated by the United States last month, was to bring together the SDF and the Kurdish National Council, or KNC. My question for you, Abdullah, is why are outside forces like France and the U.S. looking to bring these Kurdish groups together now? Why not 6 months ago, or a year ago, or 5 years ago? And how, in your view, did the talks progress?
I think France, in particular, has been trying to get the two Kurdish Syrian rivals together for quite some time, at least a couple of years. But I think they don't have enough sway or enough influence over the rival Kurdish forces to bring them together. Now we have United States, which has much more influence over both parties. So I think the reason why is because it's just they have been trying for some time, but after the Turkish incursion into let's say central north Syria and occupying these lands in Ras Al Ain and Tel Abyad, things have become even worse for Syrian Kurds, and the situation is really getting worse. I mean, politically. So the only way, I think, for Syrian Kurds to survive the Turkish, let's say, anger is somehow try to get the Kurds to get together, first of all, and try to somehow distance the SDF from PKK. I think this is the plan for now, but how much that would work depends on, both parties, and it also depends on how much both SDF and KNC are willing to make concessions. But I think that the main idea here is that they try to, first of all, make Kurds united, to make them, let's say, to have one case both against the Syrian regime and against Turkey, and to be represented internationally in, let's say, the council regarding rewriting the constitution in Syria and in other matters. So the idea is they want Kurdish to be one group, to be stronger, because right now, given that they are divided, they are weaker and they are tied to different regional agendas. If they are
You
together, obviously they would have a stronger voice and their chances to survive would be stronger.
Right. You tweeted that you saw a deal between the KNC and the PYD, the political arm of the SDF, as very unlikely, mainly because of the KNC's ties to Iraqi Kurdish leader Masoud Barzani and Barzani's ties to Turkey. Is this still your view?
Yes, I think the problem with these negotiations is that obviously it's US who's trying to reach a deal between these two rival parties, but these two parties are connected to other regional powers, both Kurdish and, let's say, regional countries. So I don't think these powers, these parties, for instance, in the case of Kurdish National Council or KNC, would give up their relations with Turkey just to, let's say, reach an agreement with SDF. I think for them, their relations with Turkey is much more strategic and important in the long term than their relations with the United States. Because whether we like it or not, no Kurdish party would trust US the way, let's say, they trust their ties with the regional countries, because nobody knows whether US would stay in this region in, let's say, 5 or even in 2 years. But Turkey would stay there. It's your neighbor, and it's going to stay there for, I don't know, forever. So I don't think they are going to trade the relations with Turkey just to, get to an agreement with the SDF. And the thing with KNC is that they are, as you said, they are tied to KDP in Iraqi Kurdistan, and KDP's relations with Turkey are really. It's just more than just Syrian Kurdistan. It's also we should consider that KDP is ruling Iraqi Kurdistan, and their border is mostly with Turkey. And Turkey, they're economically, politically, culturally very tied to Turkey. It's not. This negotiation seems to be only about Syrian Kurds, but it's really not just about Syrian Kurds. It's much more. Let's say there are much more parties involved in this problem, or in this divide between these two rival Kurdish parties.
Right, right. Turkey, of course, condemned the West's effort to unify Syria's Kurds, saying it mainly gives breathing room to a terrorist organization, which is a clear reference to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, which has waged an insurgency in southeast Turkey for almost 35 years and is labeled a terrorist organization not only by Turkey, but by the United States and the EU as well. The SDF certainly has significant links to the PKK. My question for you, Abdullah, is to what extent do you think Syrian Kurds as a whole see the SDF and or the PKK as representing their views?
I would say more than 50% of Syrian Kurds are, let's say, sympathetic toward SDF, even PKK, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing with SDF, because it has been defending these areas for a long time, and they have pushed back ISIS, they have many of their fighters have been killed. I think there are much more people now who support them. The support for this group was probably much less 10 years ago at the very beginning of the Syrian uprising, and then the subsequent Kurdish control of these areas. But now I would say they have consolidated their popularity in these areas because of this situation and because of the war. Right now, I think the majority of Syrian Kurds support SDF. Probably not 100%, obviously, but I would say it's certainly more than 50%.
Maybe 60% or 2/3 or something like this?
I would say it's probably something between 60% to 65%,
Mm-hmm.
because there are still many Syrian Kurds who are opposite to anything PKK. And also, we should remember there are hundreds of thousands of Syrian Kurds who live outside of Syria, which are mostly, let's say, anti or not very happy with SDF or its link with PKK. But I think SDF's link with PKK is not as strong as it used to be. Mazloum Abdi, who's leading SDF, I think now he has lots of autonomy to decide on his own how to go ahead with, let's say, negotiations with the KNC and how to deal with the Syrian regime. Because right now PKK itself is dealing with lots of pressure from Turkey. They have their own problems. And KCK or KJK, which is actually the umbrella organization that, let's say, both YPG in Syria and PKK are part of, has given lots of autonomy to the organizations that work in each of the 4 parts of Kurdistan in Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. So they do have lots of autonomy, actually. But I think with the recent situation with the Turkish incursion into Syria, SDF, especially Mazloum Abdi, has been given even more autonomy. He is doing lots of things on his own. Many of these initiatives are his own. So he does have, I think he has much more autonomy, let's say, compared to KNC with Barzani. I think KNC's relation with Barzani is much closer than SDF's relation with PKK right now.
Okay, we'll get to that in a little more detail later, but for now, I just wanted to go off of something you just said. So it sounds like the longer and stronger the SDF defends these lands, fights for these lands, the more popular they become. Would you agree with that?
Yes, certainly. I mean, this is also a common sense. I mean, of course, when people's security or their life is at stake, obviously they would appreciate this force much more. So I would say certainly, yeah, they have become much more popular with their defense of these lands.
Meanwhile, let's not forget there are other populations here, other ethnicities here. A Pentagon report released last week said that Russia and Assad were pressuring Arab populations in eastern and northeastern Syria to renounce their support of the SDF and realign. Yesterday, you tweeted that, quote, Russia is working to build an Arab force in northeast Syria, exploiting the worsening economic situation to recruit youth. I wonder, why is this happening? What's the objective of Assad and Russia? I seem to remember analysts saying after the U.S. departure and Turkish invasion late last year that they expected the SDF to partner with Assad. That doesn't seem to be happening.
So one of the problems with the areas controlled by SDF is that it's extremely diverse. Diversity sometimes can be a very good thing, sometimes not very good. Especially in the time of war, you have many ethnic groups which are each seeking their own interests, obviously. And I think it's the situation in northeast Syria is even more complicated because the Arab population is not one united group. They are different tribes. Especially you have 3 to 4 main tribes. The thing is, because SDF has started partnering with Al Jabur tribe, which has a much longer history in this region than the other tribes who are present in the area now. I think this has made the other tribes to also seek primary partners. I mean, obviously there are people from other tribes who are also members of SDF, but I think they don't have a primary partnership with SDF the way Al Jabur has. So they are also seeking their own interest, trying to realign with the new parties who are active in this area, such as Assad. And of course, you have Iran and Russia who are working on their own to build their own militias. So Russia has been trying to actually build a Kurdish militia in this area, but they were not successful because they had to do it through SDF, and SDF at the last minute they just withdrew their support for such a militia because of pressure from US. So
sorry, when was that? Was that this year, last couple of months?
That was within the last year. I would say in the last 6 to 8 months.
Mm-hmm.
They tried, but obviously they were not successful. So I think now they are trying their luck with Arabs, especially now because, as you just mentioned from my tweet, that the economic situation is getting worse, and Russia seems to be paying well to recruit these people. I mean, paying well with Syrian standards. So, and that's obviously a very attractive motivation for incentive for a lot of youth. And especially when you do that through, let's say, tribal chiefs, it becomes even more attractive for the youth of this tribe. Because then you have, let's say, you have much more motivation to join because your tribe doesn't mind you to join, and then you get a lot of economic incentives. So obviously that's a very good thing, or this is how they see it. That's a good thing, and they want to join this force that Russia apparently is trying to, let's say, establish especially in Hasaka province, which is in northeast Syria.
So would you say that Russia is finding some success in trying to put together this militia? And secondly, I don't think you answered the second part of that question. What's the goal of Russia and Assad in developing this force? Is it to undermine the Kurds and potentially retake the Kurdish administered area?
Yeah, just to answer your first part, when you mentioned that SDF supposed to be partnering with Assad after the Turkish incursion into the region.
Right.
That was how things supposed to go. But I think given that US didn't fully withdraw, which means SDF continued partnering with the US, things became much more, let's say, intense between SDF and Assad, because Assad doesn't want to, let's say, give Kurds or SDF any autonomy, and obviously SDF wouldn't want just to rejoin Syria the way things were pre 2011, pre the Syrian civil war. So it seems like Assad and probably Russia too want to destabilize this region through creating their own militias, and I think their plan is long term. It's not just for 1 or 2 years. What they want to do is they want to build these militias, and then they may be preparing for post-US withdrawal. They know at some point US is going to withdraw, so they are trying to establish these militias to use it as a, let's say, as a leverage against SDF in the future, because US may be thinking to guarantee some form of autonomy for SDF before their withdrawal. But now Russia and Assad may try to build these militias to somehow create problems for this plan. So this seems to be the plan, but it's still unclear if Russia would be successful in creating such a militia.
Yeah, so let me recap a bit what happened. So yeah, back in October, the U.S. committed to withdrawing from the region and ending its partnership with the SDF in order to allow Turkey to come in. Fast forward about 7 months, though, and U.S. forces are still working with the SDF, mainly, I believe, to protect the region's oil installations and as also snuff out any remaining ISIS cells. So Abdullah, in your view, what happened, and what is the extent of their cooperation today, the U.S. and the SDF?
I think there is still a good level of cooperation between SDF and US. There are even reports that US is trying to build a new force within SDF. As much as 10,000 people would be recruited for a new force under Mazloum Abdi. So the cooperation is still there. I think
a new force for what? Just patrolling the region?
Patrolling the region, and I think it would be a more elite force compared to SDF. So I think US's justification to stay obviously was to protect the oil installations, but I think it's more than that. It's just they wanted to stay after, the unprecedented pressure against Trump from both Republicans and Democrats. So he somehow had to find a way to stay. So his obviously, we know Trump and his love for this kind of things, saying, "Oh, I'm staying for the oil." Obviously, oil is part of the reason, probably, but I think it's not the whole reason. He had to stay, given the pressure from his own party and from Democrats. So that was the justification. But I think most of the cooperation that was there before partial U.S. withdrawal is still there. So I think there's still a good level of cooperation between SDF and U.S. But obviously, SDF doesn't trust U.S. the way it used to, because they have withdrawn from these areas, and there's no guarantee that U.S. is not going to fully withdraw in the near future.
This elite force you mentioned is interesting. So the United States is working with the SDF and Muslim Abdi to create this force. When did that begin, and how is it going? And is it something that you see as realistic?
I actually have read at least 2 reports about this, and yes, appears to be allocating some funding for this force, and from what I've read, the commander would be Mazlum Abdi. The exact reason or purposes of the force still are unclear, but I think they probably the purpose is just to protect this area in the future and to consolidate SDF's gains versus Turks and versus Assad in the future.
Okay. Back in, I think it was December, Turkish officials threatened to launch another offensive further into northeast Syria if the U.S. and Russia failed to clear the SDF from the area. The SDF certainly has not been cleared from the broader area. What do you think are the chances of another Turkish incursion sometime soon?
I think Turkey's plan has been slow, advanced into the SDF territory. We saw they first started with Jarablus, clearing it from ISIS, and obviously, I think at the time the primary reason was to block SDF's attempt to control all the Turkish border from Afrin to Kamishli. And then Turkey, a year after, started invading Afrin. And then next year, they started invading Ras Al Ain and Tel Abyad. So I think chances of Turkey invading SDF-controlled areas again is high. I would say they haven't given up on the idea of further incursion into the region. So the chances of Turkey invading are still, I would say, very likely and high, but they are obviously, like before, they are looking for an opportunity to do that, because we know you have Russians, you have Americans in the region, so it's not as easy as just Erdogan wanting to do that. It's more complicated, and they need to arrange with Russians and with the US. But I think Turkey wanting to invade SDF-controlled areas again is very likely, and it may. I wouldn't be surprised if it happens this year or next year.
The last time we spoke in November, Turkey had just invaded northeast Syria and was pushing back the YPG amid reports of war crimes, including roadside killings. You told me that the global attention offered an opportunity for Kurdish people in Turkey as well as in Syria to boost their cause. Now it's 6 months later. Do you think Syrian Kurds have been able to take advantage of that opportunity? You mentioned how Muslim Abdi now has more autonomy.
Yes, I do think, let's say, the global solidarity for Syrian Kurds helped them a lot. One of the byproducts of this was U.S. staying in, which was, I think, it was due to the pressure from media, obviously, of course, from both parties again, but it was partially because of all this international solidarity, which pushed the US administration to halt their full withdrawal from the area. So if we look at it, it has given Syrian Kurds lots of advantage. First of all, you have Muslim Abdi, who has more autonomy, and he's a much more known figure now. So in a way, now Syrian Kurds have, let's say, a figure that they look at as their leader, which is, I think, an important let's say, an important point for any group to gather around a leader and somehow be united. Now, we even saw after that, Mazlum Abdi initiated this, let's say, talks with the KNC to bring them back to Rojava to have a Kurdish unity. That was also, I think, in a way, a byproduct of this, let's say, international solidarity, which gave lots of advantage to Syrian Kurds. Again, another thing was now US is trying to bring together the Syrian Kurds. I think indirectly it was also a byproduct of all this international attention and international solidarity for Syrian Kurds.
Okay, now to Kurds in Turkey. Since last year's local elections, the Turkish government has removed from office 45 of the 65 mayors from the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party and replaced them with appointees. And yet the HDP is still struggling to respond. Earlier this month, the HDP parliamentarian Ahmet Şık resigned from the party, basically saying it had no direction. The last time we spoke, you said the HDP was really losing influence and needed to find a way to revive or re-energize their base. Do you think that has been happening?
I think problem with HDP now is that they are. It's, again, I think it's their situation is still very similar to when we talked last time. They are losing support from the street, especially in the Kurdish areas. Especially now, I think after their Congress, when they elected these new co-leaders, Medhat and Pervin, I think, in a way, it seems that HDP tried to elect these in a way to have, let's say, less, in a way to reconcile or to be less hostile to the to Erdogan and the ruling party, because these two figures are known to be much less critical and much more, let's say, protective in the way they talk about Turkey and about Erdogan. So I think this has angered the HDP base even more, because even with these new waves of arrest, the way we see the statements from the HDP co-leaders is really weak, and really I think there is no justification to talk in this style, because basically it seems that they are giving up and they are not trying anymore. Because if you remember a few days ago, after the arrest, we saw HDP co-leader Medhat Senjar. He talked in a way as if they have done wrong. At least this is how I understood. I think when it comes to these violations by Turkey, especially removing elected mayors like this, you should be much more, let's say, much more open about your criticism, because this is unjust and there's no justification whatsoever. I mean, in some cases, maybe you should be much more, let's say, laid back, and you should try to be much more careful about the way you talk. But when it comes to this level of unjust, removing your mayors every day while they gotten elected in an environment that it was already very difficult for HDP to win any votes, and now you see the way they talk about it, especially the statements from the HDP co-leaders, I think this is alienating more and more HDP base in the Kurdish areas. And I have personally lots of Turkish Kurds friends who are very angry at HDP and the way they are dealing with the situation.
Right, just this past weekend, their response to Erdogan's criticisms of the HDP was all they did was essentially call for new elections in these municipalities. I was like, well,
Very, very weak response, I would say.
yeah. Okay, last question for you, then I'll let you go. Rojava authorities on Sunday announced a mass prison amnesty for the Muslim holiday of Eid al-Fitr later this week, which will exclude murderers, rapists, and terrorists, among others. This made me think of the 10,000 or so Islamic State fighters held in Rojava prisons, as well as in Al-Hol camp, which houses some 10,000 women and children linked to ISIS militants. There have been some whispers of an ISIS revival amid the pandemic. How do you think Syrian Kurdish authorities have done so far in regards to managing and controlling the ISIS presence there?
I think they have done a pretty good job. I mean, there has been a couple attempts by ISIS prisoners to do the riot and even to escape. But I think so far, if we look at the region, especially in a place like Iran, prisoners managed to flee. Iran, which has a much stronger state and it has a much better reputation when it comes to protecting their presence and so on. Even they couldn't fully, in a way, protect the presence, and we have seen prison break, at least one prison break in Iran. But in Rojava, there has been attempts, but they have blocked it, and I think so far they have done a really good job. Because we should know their resources are limited, and as you say, there's some sort of resurgence of ISIS in the region, especially in Iraq. I think it's much more limited in Syria, but still they're obviously exploiting the situation and try to use this situation to at least attempt to break prisons or to exploit the situation to spread chaos and do more of what they do. But I think so far the administration in Rojava has done a good job, and we haven't seen any major problems with the ISIS prisoners.
So you're not fearing an ISIS resurgence in Syria and region, at least anytime soon?
I think when it comes to the SDF areas, the only weak point from how I see it personally is Deir ez-Zor. Deir ez-Zor is there are already lots of problems between SDF and the Arabs in the area. We should know that Deir ez-Zor is 100% Arab Sunni region, and it's also very tribal, and they have strong links with Anbar in Iraq, which is neighbors with Deir ez-Zor. And we know that ISIS is very active, or has been very active throughout the years in Anbar, and given that they're neighbors with Deir ez-Zor, I wouldn't be surprised if there would be ISIS activities in Deir ez-Zor. But up in the north, I think chances of ISIS revival is much more limited.
Okay, Kurdish affairs analyst Abdulla Hawez, thank you so much for your time and insights. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.